and he said, there was this chap called David McMullen. Why don't you do what he did? So I did what he did. I ended up at St. John's. David became my supervisor. Brilliant choice.
Tim, thank you again for...
You're welcome for the trailer, yes.
Yes, so we had the trailer, and today we're continuing with the discussion.
I realised that with the trailer I put you into a sort of provincial British situation, the city of Bristol, which is cosmopolitan but in a slightly sinister way. There is something else which will lead us quickly on to my time at Cambridge and other stuff that folks might like to know, rather than, my parents being poor but honest and all that background stuff. I was actually raised in the countryside between Bristol and Bath. In fact, I went to Bath for school, but in a boarding school near there. Now, what was I doing in a boarding school? Well, my father had no money, but my mother had some, and she had worked for a while before marrying, involved in childcare for a teacher in this boarding school, and in fact, it was a couple of kids, and one of them grew up to be Sir Tim Lancaster, who became director of SOAS. So, in fact, I was able to ask my mother anything I ought to know about Sir Tim, and she said, well, I found that when you woke him up after his afternoon nap, he could be a bit tetchy. So I remembered that, but I never woke him up after his afternoon nap at SOAS, so I was okay. But it did mean that she did know about this school. It was an interesting school. It's called Monkton Combe. And it was largely for the sons of missionaries. A lot of people, well, not largely, there were all kinds of people, local tradespeople would send their kids there if they had money to burn on kids' education and so forth. But there were a lot of kids who were born in China because their parents were in the China Inland Mission. One guy was in upcountry Burma, where he was the only, European child in the whole district, and he had the experience of, being a sort of unusual in that way for all these are upcountry. It was not Burmese; it was Karen or Kachin or whoever. So it's again a very cosmopolitan in a certain situation, in a certain sense, and it was okay. I checked recently the statistics that they published in the 1940s. 15% of the products of this school became clergymen, and 5% actually became missionaries. That was still true with some of my contemporaries. One became a flying missionary, which is like a flying doctor. Missionaries sort of need to get about doing good, So he became a kind of pilot for missionaries, but others did become clergymen. One of my classmates would have been a bishop, but he was actually a Presbyterian, so he became sort of big in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. So there was this interesting, in a way, cosmopolitan environment, but it was very much from a certain point of view. And for reasons I won't go into, but I could explain, I just felt, missionaries all very well, but how about the cannibals? How about the opposition? And so I did have a teacher who I said, look, reading Sophocles and so forth and Plato is all very well, but I think I'd like to do something non-European. And he said, well, we did have 10 years ago somebody who decided to do Chinese at Cambridge. You could do that. And this is a guy who'd seen a bit of the world himself. He was briefly, during the war, in charge of all the Japanese prisoners in Thailand at the end of the war. So he'd seen a bit of the world. And he said, there was this chap called David McMullen. Why don't you do what he did? So I did what he did. I ended up at St. John's. David became my supervisor. Brilliant choice. The man made a good choice for me. So this was a kind of excellent time to be at Cambridge. Dennis Twitchett had not arrived. There was an interregnum. But David was a wonderful teacher, especially on a one-to-one basis, then there were some very interesting fellow students, Francis Wood for one. You have to remember in those days there were the ratio of men to women in Cambridge was 10-1.
Wow.
Yeah, which meant that Frances could really enjoy herself. However, the people who were teaching, including people like Michael Lowy, you can go and ask him what it was like in those days, but also Piet van der Loon, and he was an education, you know. Francis rolled in one morning, having been partying all night, and he said to her, "I don't blame you for not wanting to study Chinese. When I was young, I didn't want to study Chinese either. I wanted to blow up Germans," because he was in the Dutch resistance, and found out at his memorial service, never suspected this, that he had the occupation sinologist on his identity card. Most of the occupying forces didn't know what a sinologist was, so he could sort of bluff his way all kinds of places. And what he was doing, he was using his bicycle to ferry Jewish children from one hideout to another. So he would have been dead if he'd been caught, but he got away with it. He was also a holy terror, as you may have heard. We were being taught down on Brooklands Avenue. You probably know this.
No.
Oh, well, we moved into this place where we are now in our third term, but for a couple of terms we were still down on Brooklands Avenue. It's a tall house near the station end, and that's where we were. And all the library and the teaching was in this multi-storey house for Oriental studies, you know. And we heard that Piet had been teaching there, and he had come across a Thai Chinese who was using a Matthews dictionary, and he had seized the book from him and tossed it out of the window, saying, "You of all people should not be using this book." And this we heard, but we just thought it was one of those stories about a crazy guy. But I actually met the Thai Chinese, who had meanwhile retreated to a monastery. And he said, yeah, he took the book from me and threw it out of the window.
Why?
Because students shouldn't have been using it. As you know, it's a hopeless dictionary. Except, I mean, to speak up for it, it encapsulates the chaos of the Chinese language in the 1930s. Mm. You know, establishing new standards was clearly very difficult, and Matthews didn't help. So Piet was a bit of a holy terror. Although if you stood up to him, he was fine. David McMullen says that one of his contemporaries called him a pie-faced Hollander within his hearing, and Piet just laughed. And he was also an education to us, because I think one of our predecessors had complained that they wanted to read an interesting bit of the Zhuangzi, so that he was persuaded to do Autumn Floods for the first time.
Yes.
Yeah, which is nice. And his wife, Minnie van der Loon, actually showed up to the class, except they would exchange their questions in Dutch, which didn't help us entirely. And he always used, Minnie was brought up in Japan, perhaps.
No, I didn't know.
Well, he always told us, if you're going to be a sinologist, marry a Japanese or someone who knows Japanese. That was his advice. I'm not sure if it was the best advice, but hey. Anyhow, Minnie was in this class. And the cool thing about it was that we're going through Autumn Floods, and there's a word we come across, and the glosses just faff around, and he says, actually, there's no means of telling what it does mean. We know from the word family it's in, we could give a guess, but we don't know, so I'm not going to translate it. And we all thought, cool. Yeah. He's not even translating the set text, but it was an education to us that in an ancient text there are bound to be words where you can't be 100% sure. You can make a guess, as he said. So it was all a slightly bizarre experience, but we learned stuff. And then Dennis Twitchett was
Hold on, can I ask also
Yes.
what kinds of texts you read other than the autumn flood and the drones, and what was on the
syllabus?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go for early China. We had we had some Shiji. What did we have? I can't remember which Buddhist Shiji, but clearly Michael had put the Loon on as well. He gave us an extra class on the Loon. He gave us, in fact, it was an extra lecture. It was on Lucretius, Wang Chung, and death. Michael has always been very Michaelish and still is wonderful. But for the tongue, Puli Blank, who disapproved of poetry, had put Baijui's Xin Yue Fu on the syllabus because Chen Yinke had already done his study of the historical background to that. So he said, if they have to do some poetry, let them have a load of history with it too. But that was in the final years. We started off with the 19 old poems.
Okay, yeah.
That wouldn't have been in the first year, that would have been in the second year, because I can remember Dennis Twitchett going through them with us. And Dennis had been taught by Loon, and so although we think of him as a historian, he was also into stuff like rhyme schemes and telling us all about, what the rhymes would have been, etc., etc. And the textual history of the Wenshuan that contains the 19 old poems, stuff that we didn't appreciate at the time, but, we were willy-nilly getting some kind of an education. The Baizhui poems, actually, there was a Chinese guy in the class who was a keen bridge player. He wasn't very interested in doing any work. He was related to Anson Chan, the Hong Kong politician. I think he might have been her brother, but he asked me to do a sort of rough translation of them, and I was entertained when I came back to teach 4 years later to find that the students still using my translation. But that's the way it is with set texts. If you don't vary them enough.
Now they're all up on the web, on the internet.
Right.
Yes.
So then there were some special set texts I did for the tongue, a biography. Dennis Twitchett, of course, took us through the treatise on financial administration that had been his PhD, and so of course I rushed to the UL, University Library, to see what his translation had been, and got the translation delivered to me from the closed stacks. Open it up and it says, for technical reasons the translation is not included in this PhD. So nice one, he got away with that. But it was all I can't imagine having had a better education, except of course nobody was trying very hard to teach us to speak Chinese, because it was there was some audio facilities and tapes and things, but we only had one guy from Taiwan who was supposed to be the language teacher. Eventually we had some money which came in for something more sophisticated that was orientated towards contemporary Beijing standard. But the guy from Taiwan is actually quite interesting. He was the younger brother of this 1930s intellectual called Wu Mi. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of the name? No. He was a very interesting guy, largely known for being very learned, but also for his pointless affairs with his students. But it meant that in the biographical dictionary of Republican China, you got some idea of their family background, and the father had been a provincial governor in North China, which was in the 1920s, of course, quite a crazy place. And Dr. Wu knew some interesting things that I tried to pass on to my students, like how to chop a man's head off. And just in case you have to deal with this yourself, he explained to me that most people think you get a sword, you got a neck, you just go jong like that. No, It's not like that. You've got to treat it like slicing bread. You've got to go shtoom acrosswise, like so. I thought, yeah, I'll remember that. And I try and teach my students.
Very useful.
Yeah.
Hands-on.
Yes,
Technology.
absolutely. So I can't say it wasn't interesting.
When was this?
I came up in 1967 and left in 1971.
Okay.
As I was approaching graduation, Dennis said to me, we need somebody in Buddhist studies, in Chinese studies, because we did have somebody in SOAS, but he left to go to Yale. That was Stanley Weinstein. Why don't you go to Yale and study with him? All you need is an international scholarship. So I said, yeah, and yeah. And so that's what I went for. And I did get to Yale, somewhat flukily, because you have to do this GRE. You probably did a GRE. Yes, the graduate record exam.
Yeah.
I'm absolutely hopeless at maths. I was doing, Latin and Greek at school. Catastrophic at maths, and I hadn't done any at all since for at least 7 years. So my results were terrible, but fortunately Weinstein was also catastrophic at maths, so he let me in. His own history is extraordinary. At his memorial service, his son, who's an eminent professor of Japanese economics, explained it to us. And I could go into it, but it's that's his story in a way. Extraordinary man. He had ended up in the Korean War and had in intelligence, which he said was hilarious because it was being run by somebody who was stupid but who had not left the US Army since the Second World War, and therefore by seniority was promoted to intelligence. But anyhow, he got through that, and I could tell you his stories. But and he qualified for the GI Bill, and so he said, I'm going to go to a Japanese university and study Buddhism. So he did. He went to Komazawa. Have you ever been to Komazawa? No. You know some of the scholarship. They don't do so much for Dunhuang. They did have some people.
Yeah, they do Buddhist studies.
Buddhist studies for the most part. Yeah. And he came top of his class because it's mainly a university for hereditary owners of temples. And there were some smart people there, but by sheer diligence, he came top of his class. And then he went on to Tokyo University. And then realizing that this was not going to get him a job unless he went somewhere Anglophone, he got to Harvard. And from Harvard, he eventually got a job in SOAS for a while. And then he got a good offer from Yale. It was happening a lot. In the 1960s, as it does now, British salaries were so poor that a lot of people were simply being bought up by American universities. Cyril Birch, one or two others left at that point. As you know, eventually Dennis did, but he did stick around for a while, fortunately for me and for other people here. Stanley Weinstein told me that once when he was teaching in London, he was given a couple of theatre tickets. They didn't have the money to get into town to see the theatre. So if you think conditions are wretched, well, they always were. The only thing they could afford to drink was sherry, but they drank quite a bit of it, so it was fairly happy times in SOAS, I gather.